While lighting an exterior shot taking place at night can definitely be tricky and with its own challenges, it also comes with an equal amount of opportunities to get creative with your lighting that might not have been possible for a daylight shot. In this video, I'll walk you through the whole process of how I built this shot, all the way from scene assembly to lighting, atmospherics, and rendering. At the end, we'll pick our render frames up in Nuke and show you how you can easily add that final touch of tweaks and grading in compositing. Almost all of this scene was built using models from Megascans. Now, while Megascans of course are not free for us over here in the Unity side of the pool, I was able to buy all of these assets with just a single month subscription. Now, for the characters, these are basically just the free default Mixamo animation models. All I did was give them a new set of UVs as well as a quick texturing pass in Substance Painter. Now, this shot is set up to use ray tracing inside of HDRP. Here you can see a list of the features that I have enabled in my project and that I've added support for in the scene's global volume. Now, if you don't know what these mean or how to set this up, I did make a video earlier this year going through that whole process in painstaking detail that you can check out right here. Now, with all that out of the way, let's jump into the editor and start pointing some lights at some robots. Okay, so we're now inside the Unity scene. I've stripped out all of the lights. All that's visible in the scene right now as far as lights go are whatever the fallbacks for the Unity project are. Okay, so let's just have a quick look at the scene. If I go to my scene view, you can see that this scene is 100% set up just for this one shot. As soon as we start moving this camera around, like we can see through a lot of stuff, there's nothing really going on the sides or behind where our camera is located. Now, like I mentioned in the introduction, this is for the most part all Megascans. I'm also using a few decals just to add some details around the scene. So I have one that's adding these little pieces of basically just garbage on the side of the road. I have a couple of graffiti ones, as you can see here. And back here as well, I'm using a couple of decals for these drip stains. Okay, so before we start setting up any lighting at all, we need to make sure that everything as far as our camera and the way that our scene handles exposure, that is set up the way that we want it to, so that we're not adjusting and setting up a bunch of lights to work in a camera or scene setting that is incorrect. And as soon as we change that, then we have to go back through all our lights and readjust them after making those changes. So first thing, we'll have a look at my global volume. These are all the overrides that I have set up for this scene. As you can see, I've turned a few of them off right now just to make the scene a little snappier to work with. And this is something that I will usually do when working with a scene that's using heavier post-processing, just that I'm able to move around and make changes quicker. And then I'll just periodically turn everything on just to see how everything is working and how the systems are working together. But I'll keep some of these heavier ones off while I'm doing things like placing out lights or placing out geometries and doing scene assembly and stuff like that. So right now, the only ones that are currently active are the ambient occlusion one. The ray traced ambient occlusion is not really that heavy, and it does make a pretty significant difference in how the scene looks, just because the standard HDRP ambient occlusion makes the scene a lot darker than what it will end up actually being, which then again would lead me to maybe add too much light to the scene to try to compensate. So if I try and turn this off, you can see that my whole scene goes a lot darker and a lot flatter. But if I turn my ray traced ambient occlusion on, you can see that it's a lot more detailed, it's a lot brighter, and definitely a lot more accurate. And the way I've set it up is everything is basically just default. I've turned the intensity up by 0.5, 1 being the default, just to get a little more darkening in the deepest recesses. And I've set the max ray length to 10, which basically just decides the maximum distance a object can be from another surface before it starts adding occlusion to that object. Now, one more thing that we should have a look at before we have a look at our camera is I've added an exposure override to this global volume, and I've set the mode to physical camera. What this override is going to do for us is make sure that anything that has to do with exposure for our scene is going to be controlled by our camera. So now if I just select my render cam, so if I jump into the scene view, you can see that this is just a basic Unity camera. But if I go over to the inspector, I have checked this physical camera option, which in turn is giving me all of these camera settings or all these camera properties. And all of these are basically what you would expect to find on a real life camera. I started off by selecting the 65mm Alexa as my sensor type. This is just going to give me a bunch of default settings, most importantly being the sensor size. Now for the ISO, and what the ISO is basically the light sensitivity of our sensor. So the lower this number, the lower the sensitivity for light our sensor is going to have, meaning that our image is going to be darker. Now 20 is a really low number and probably not a number that you would find on basically any standard market camera. However, we are going to be using some pretty high intensity light sources for this shot, meaning that we're going to need to have a lower light sensitivity of our camera to not have it be all the way blown out. Now, the way that this would work in a real life setting is that you wouldn't be able to go this low on your ISO. However, what you would do to compensate for that is using something called an ND filter physically on the lens of the camera that blocks a certain amount of stops of light from entering into the lens itself. However, we don't have that option on our Unity camera, but luckily we're free to just lower this to whatever number that fits our project. So this is set down to 20. The shutter speed, since we're rendering this at 25 frames per second, the shutter speed is set at 50. Now my focal length is set to 26. This is just an artistic decision. So I just framed up my camera and I adjusted my focal length accordingly just to get the look that I wanted for this shot. The aperture is set to 2.2, and this is going to control both how bright our rendered frame is, as well as the amount of depth of field or how shallow our depth of field ends up being. Now, if I open up the rendering tab, for this project, I'm going to be using DLSS and dynamic resolution. You'll have this available to you if your workstation has a NVIDIA graphics card. You will also have to enable this in your project, which is something else that I go over in the video that I linked earlier on how to set up a ray traced scene for HDRP. But as you can see, I've turned this off for now. And the reason for this is that when I'm lighting these shots, I don't necessarily want to have a lot of processes going that are actively changing the way that the scene looks. Because a lot of anti-aliasing solutions do things like soften out or average out pixel values to be able to do an effective job of anti-aliasing and removing things like noise. However, while I'm working, I like to see what's actually going on as sharply as possible. Then I can go in and turn on something like DLSS at the end, but then at least I know that everything underneath, how that looks, and then I can adjust how intense I want these anti-aliasing processes to affect my image. So right now it's turned off and post anti-aliasing is set to no anti-aliasing. So effectively we now have no anti-aliasing processing going on our shot at all. Now the last thing about our camera that I've changed from defaults is instead of having my background type set to sky, which it is by default. This is just going to show whatever sky setup that you have in your scene. I've changed this to color, and I've set this to be a black color because basically I just want anywhere that I've not placed any objects, I just want that to basically disappear into darkness. And what's up here, it's both going to be colored by fog, as well as I would just want this to be like a pitch black night sky. Now you can see that I have an animator here as well. The only animation that's in this scene that I've added to a timeline is just moving my camera. It's a very basic camera move. I've also added a slight bit of animation to this glowing robot guy back here. And all it's doing is basically just moving up in Y while rotating around its own axis. Let's get started on lighting. So as you can see right now, our scene is pretty dark. It's really flat. There's nothing really directional going on with any of our lighting. And the only reason that we can see anything in this scene right now at all is that if I go under my global volume again, under the visual environment, I have the sky type set to HDRI Sky. Now, I don't actually have an HDRI Sky in this scene at the moment. However, since it's looking for one and can't find one, it's just using the project's fallback, which is just the sky that we saw in the background here when I changed what the background was showing. Now, just double checking that I have HDRI Sky turned on. I'll go back down here to the Add Override button. I'll click that. I'll type HDRI. And what will now happen as soon as that we turn that on is that our visual environment is currently looking for an HDRI Sky override. And as soon as we enable this, it's going to switch to that. Now you can see that this looks kind of flat and weird now, and that is because we don't actually have a cube map added. Now I've chosen a HDRI map from Polyhaven for this, which is where I usually go for all of my HDRI cube maps. I've added that to my project. So if I just click this little circle and I'll choose the Hansa plots for K1. And if I go back into my scene view, you can see that this is our HDRI Sky Dome. And this is the image that I just loaded in. Now for this specific shot, I'm not actually going to be using the HDRI as my main light source. For a lot of types of shots, you would definitely be using the HDRI as your main light source, especially if you're rendering something that is going to be integrated into an existing plate that's been shot on a camera. You would probably have an HDRI from that set, and you would want that to basically be the basis for most of your lighting. However, I'm only going to be using the HDRI for really low intensity ambient lighting, just filling in some of the shadows. It's also going to be acting as the fallback for whatever reflective surfaces that we have in our scene, especially for surfaces that are rougher than whatever limit that we set on the screen space reflections. That is then going to fall back to reflecting whatever your sky is showing. In this case, that is going to be our HDRI. However, this is currently way too bright. So if I go back to my game view and back to my global volume, the first thing that I'll do is I'll turn on this intensity mode setting, and this by default is set to exposure. You can choose multiplier or a lux. We'll stick with exposure, and I'll turn on this exposure compensation checkbox. You can see that everything goes really dark, but as I start turning this up, you can see that our scene gets brighter again. Now, as I said, I don't necessarily want this to affect our scene that much. However, I'll start off by setting it back up to be pretty bright again. The reason for this is that I'm going to change the rotation of this map. And it's a little easier to see when it's actually affecting the scene. So if I go back into my scene view, you can see that if I turn on this rotation checkbox, if I start moving this slider, you can see that it's rotating our light dome, which is of course having a pretty significant effect on our scene here because there are so many different types of light sources in this scene. Somewhere around here is probably going to be good for this. So go back to my game view, and now I can turn this back down. And when I was testing this, I ended up actually as far down as 8 in my exposure compensation. And you can see that this is fairly dark, but we're still getting some detail in here. So whatever surfaces we're not actually hitting with our sourced light sources or our practical lights is still going to have a little bit of detail to them. Now you can see if I go back to my scene view again as well, and let me just turn this light back up just so we can see what's going on here. In addition to the models that we're actually seeing in this shot, I also have some just basic Unity cube primitives placed around here. And these are, for the most part, just working as light blockers. When I was looking through my render camera, I could see areas that were getting a little too much light for what I was looking for. So they were stealing attention from whatever I wanted to actually be the focal point of the image. And the way that I ended up solving that is by placing these light blockers. So these ones and these cubes right here, they're just blocking some of these very strong light sources from affecting parts of the scene. And this can be a really effective tool when it comes to shaping the light of your scene, especially when it comes to off-screen light sources that you might just want to affect parts of your shot. You will usually not end up being able to get the effect that you want from just rotating or pointing your light sources around. Now, the way that I like to work with shots like this is to start with my strongest, most hero light sources and get those set at least 90% of the way to where I want them. Then I'll go into all the detail lighting after that. So our main light source for this scene is going to be a directional light, which will be shining in from this hole in the ceiling here. What I want the focal point of this scene to be is this glowing guy right over here, and as well as the crater that he has left behind underneath him. So what I'll do is I'll go back into my scene here. I'll go into my hierarchy, hit this little plus, and under the light menu, I'll add a directional light. And I'll move this to somewhere that I can see. Now, with the directional light, it doesn't actually matter where this light source is located in 3D space. Rotation is the only thing that matters. Now, what we could, of course, do is that I can grab my game view and I can just dock it on the side here instead. And now I can have a smaller preview of what my game view will look like. Obviously, this light source is way too bright, and it's also shining through basically everything. It's not casting any shadows. So I'll start by turning the intensity down so everything isn't as blown out. Now, like I said, I want this light to kind of shine through this hole right here and draw attention to the center point for this shot, which is this crater. So I'll just start rotating this around. Now, right now it can be kind of hard to see what's going on because this is not casting any shadows. So what I can do is with my light, my directional light selected, if I go to the inspector, under shadows, I'll enable shadow maps. And you can see that now we're actually getting shadows. So the light isn't going through our light blockers and our scene geometry. So now we're getting light that's shining through this hole and hitting this crater right here. This is an HDRI scene and we are going to be using ray tracing. So I'm going to turn on screen space shadows and then I'll turn on ray trace screen space shadows. Now we actually have an accurate representation of what our shadows are going to look like. For the sample count, this is going to be our main light source. So I'll set this up to 8 samples. Again, just like with the anti-aliasing, I also actually tend to turn off denoising when I'm working with the lighting, This is because the denoisers can sometimes be a little too intense, ending up washing out a lot of the shadow detail, making it really hard to see what your light sources are doing and what it's going to look like at the end. So under denoise, I'll turn denoiser off. And usually the directional light isn't going to be that noisy anyways. So often after I've turned on DLSS, I don't actually end up using the denoiser for quite a wide selection of the lights in my scene actually. In my project, I also have contact shadows turned on, which is going to help us get a lot more crisp shadow detail for smaller objects in the scene, which is going to be really helpful. Especially in this scene where we have a lot of little rubble and small pipes and details spread around the scene. So I'll turn contact shadows on. Right now we're not going to see much because most of the lighting is going on over here, but we'll be turning on contact shadows for some of our other lights, which are going to have a bigger effect over here. So I'll just start lining this light up, getting it to hit where I want it to. So with my light placed like this, you can see that we're getting a pool of light on our crater, which is what we're looking for. We're also getting this really nice rim lighting on the broken edge on this ceiling right here. Right now, I'm finding this light source to be a little too sharp. The way that we can soften up some of these edges so you can see this shadow line right here is really, really crisp. And what I would like is for this to soften out just a little bit, and especially to get more of a penumbra-like effect where the shadow is a little sharper closer to the shadow casting object, and then it gets softer as it travels away from that object. The way to change that in the directional light is under shape, and you have this angular diameter. This is set to 0.5, which means that this light source is physically really small. And the way that a light source works is that the bigger the light source is and the closer that big light source is to the object, the softer the shadows are going to be. So I'm going to set this to 20. And now you can see that these shadows right here, if you keep an eye on those, if I turn this back to 0.5, they go really sharp. But if I put it to 20, you can see that this softens out a lot. It just looks a lot more natural because a light source like this would be, first of all, probably pretty big, and it would be getting diffused through the atmosphere that it's shining through. And since we're going to be adding a lot of fog to this, it does make sense that the light sources should be a little diffuser. Now it's a little warm to my liking right now. I do want this to be a colder light. So under emission, I'm going to set the color temperature to 10,000, which is going to give us a pretty cold light source. So the higher this number is, the colder the color of light is going to be. Now, I do want this to be a lot more intense. One reason for this is that as soon as we add fog to this, I want it to really brighten up that fog. And when we enable the ray traced GI, I also want there to be enough light for this to start bouncing around and lighting up some of these other surfaces as well. So I'm going to set this to around 44,000 lux. And you can see now that where it's hitting directly is getting a lot brighter. And this is also going to leave us with enough light energy to actually get some really nice global illumination effects from this light source. All right, so next up, let's start adding some practical light sources. Like I mentioned at the beginning, lighting an urban night scene like this does come with its own set of idiosyncrasies and considerations that make it an interesting challenge. Because a street environment could have a huge number of light sources, many of which could be outside of the camera view, you are a lot freer to play with colored lights and accent lights without breaking the realism of your lighting, as compared to a daylight scene where the sun and the HDRI would be your main light sources. In a setting like that, it would be unlikely that another practical light would be able to compete with the sunlight, and you would mostly be working with bounce and fill lights to affect your shadow sides. Okay, so what I have here is my first practical light that I'm going to be replacing into the scene. You can basically use any type of light source that you want for this. You could use an area light, you could use a point light, you could use a spotlight. What I'm currently using for these is a point light. However, what I've done with the light sources that I'm setting up here is that I've used the IES light importer in Unity to import a IES profile into my project. And that automatically builds a IES light prefab in your project. So if I have my light selected, you can see that it's just a point light. However, it has this IES profile connected to it, which is a separate light profile light that I've downloaded from ieslibrary.com, which is a website that houses a huge range of these IES profiles that are usually provided by the actual manufacturers of that light. Like if you're looking for a specific General Electric light bulb or light source, those are profiles that these manufacturers actually provide for free on their websites. What's nice about IES Library is that they've just collated a lot of these profiles and made it just a lot easier to browse through and just search for specific ones. They also show previews of what those light sources look like, which is really helpful. Now, the reason for using an IES profile instead of just using a straight up area light is that it just has a little more detail to it. So a normal flat area light is going to be very uniform in the way that it distributes light. With a IES profile like this, so if I start placing this, you should be able to see it a little clearer. You can see that the light makes this pattern of light intensity on the wall, and without an IES profile, this would just gradually get softer from the center of where the light source is hitting and out towards the edges. But with this profile, you're getting a lot more of this streaky detail in your light sources. And it just ends up looking not just more detailed, but just a lot more realistic, because these are the types of light sources that you're actually used to seeing in the real world. Now, I'm not going to go really in depth in how to set up IES lights in this specific video. However, if that is something that you would want me to quickly run you through how to set this up, definitely just let me know and I can absolutely make a separate video on that subject. Now, in addition to these wall lights, the other type of light source that I have in here that you can see in the shot are these light posts. So you can see that I've placed quite a few of them. So if I select this group, you can see that I've placed 3 of them on each side of this street. So I'll just have to go through and just add a light to each one of these. So I'll grab another one of these IES lights. Again, you can see by the way that it hits the ground as well that there's just a little more detail here. And this is definitely going to give us more detail as well when we add fog to this scene, because the way that this will then interact with that atmospheric fog is going to look more detailed and look a lot more realistic than if we did not have this IES profile. So I'll start off by move this over here to the first lamp. Now, of course, the placement of this light pole or the way that I'm rotating this light is definitely not random. So I'm not just putting it here because I want a street lamp here. I'm actually using this light source to light up these 2 characters down here. So since I have this little scene going on right here with this guy hiding behind a wall and this guy sitting down crouching behind this barrel, if I go into my game view, the actual practical function that I want this light to have is to draw a little bit of attention to what's going on over here. So while I'm trying to line up the origin of this light to where the light bulb would basically be in this lamp, I'm definitely not opposed to rotating this light source around. and having it point in a direction that's technically not the direction the light from this lamp would go. But you're not really going to be able to tell that from this game view. All you'll see is that there's light coming from here and it's hitting something down here. And that leaves me with the freedom to move and rotate my light in a way that actually ends up having the desired effect on the scene itself. Now you can see that for these practical lights, the temperature of the light is set way lower than what we set this to. So I wanted this to be a really cold and harsher light, while practical lights are very often a lot warmer. Some of these would probably be fluorescent and colder light. However, I do want these to be warm to act as a contrast to all the cold lighting and the cooler colors that are going on in the center of the image. And of course, make sure that all your practical lights have shadow map turned on and ray traced shadows turned on as well. So what I'm going to do is I'll just go through and place all the other practical light sources. And when that is done, we'll move on to the next step. Fog and atmosphere can be a great addition to a shot. Not only can you use it to set the mood of the scene, but it's also a super efficient tool to add depth and detail to the shot and to accent your light sources. Even on an interior film set, a director or a DOP will often opt to add a subtle layer of haze to the shot using a smoke machine or a hazer for those exact reasons. I think it's time that we add the atmospheric fog to this. Now, there are two ways to add fog in Unity. Adding it to our global volume is going to add a fog that's basically affecting the entire scene, while a local fog would just be affecting within a set bounding box decided by us. So I'll select my global volume, I'll hit add override, and I'll choose the fog volume override. Now let's enable this, hit enable and enable. And you can see that not much is happening yet. That is because we need to start setting some of these settings first. First, I'll turn on the fog attenuation distance, which is basically going to control how thick the fog is at a certain distance. I'm going to set this way down to something like 50. And now you can see that it's actually starting to dim down a lot closer to our camera. So if I keep pulling this down, you can see that the fog is going to thicken. So at 3, you can see that it's already getting basically so thick that you can't see through it at just a couple of meters from the camera. But I'll set this to 50. I'll set the color mode to use the sky color. Now we want this to be volumetric fog, which is just a way higher quality volume fog. So I'll enable this. And as you can see, this makes a huge difference. So this fog is basically just set to dim down and start tinting things based on the Z distance from the camera. However, the volumetric fog is going to take all the light sources into account. Here you can see we're starting to get these really nice light shafts from all our light sources. And because we have IES profiles for this, we're also getting a lot more detail in these light shafts than what we would if this was just a straight up spotlight or area light. Now I'll go down and change a few of these settings as well. So under volumetric fog distance, I want to make this a little higher. I'll set this to 150, which is going to give us fog all the way back here as well. You can see we're getting this nice deep fog color here. I'll enable slice distribution uniformity and make sure that this is set to a value that's somewhere between 0.5 and 0.75. What this does, it basically controls the fidelity of the fog based on the distance from the camera. So if this is set to 1, it's just going to be linear all the way from the closest to the farthest part of the fog, meaning that you're getting the same amount of volumetric fog slices all the way from the closest to the camera and back to the furthest point. What that will usually end up doing though is if I pull this up, you can see that the fog that's closer to the camera ends up being a lot lower quality. Now it is actually as high quality as the stuff that's way back here, but since it's closer, we can see the noise and these anomalies a lot better. So what you usually want is somewhere that's low enough to where you're getting enough quality close to the camera, but without losing too much accuracy in the distant parts that you're actually seeing in the shot. So I'll just leave this at 0.75. Under quality, I'll set this to custom. Now this volumetric fog can get really heavy real fast, so I like to have this fog control mode set to balance. That's usually a pretty good trade-off between performance and visual quality. Now under volumetric fog budget, I'm going to set this up a little bit. This is going to give us a little bit higher quality fog without actually making my computer catch fire. So I'll set this at 0.75. And you can see now that some of these weird noise patterns that we had here now disappeared. However, keep in mind that this is pretty heavy. So setting this all the way up to 1 might end up making your scene a little too heavy to work with, especially when you start mixing this with things like SSGI. And if I go back into my first lamp here, one thing to keep in mind is to make sure that under volumetrics that it is enabled. And you also have this multiplier slider, which can come in really handy as just an art direction tool for how you want these light shafts to look. So if I increase this slider, the density of the light shafts from this light is increasing. And if I think it's too dense, then I can just turn this lower. And if I just quickly step through all of these, you can see that most of them I have set at 1, but some of them, just for artistic reasons, I've increased just a little bit. Okay, so now we're getting to the part where we can start refining the interesting parts of our scene using accent lights. While our main scene lighting is coming from what is happening down the street and from the street lamps, there are a few areas of interest that using only the key lighting ends up being either a little hidden away in shadow or just a little flat and uninteresting. Using lights coming from off camera, we can accent these areas and get more shape and dimensionality to the forms that are there. So just like with me right now standing here, the only practical light source that you can actually see on screen is that little table lamp over there, while in reality, that is not actually lighting me up from any angle that the camera can actually see. However, there are 3 other light sources in this room that are just off camera. So I have a big softbox over here that is giving me my soft key light. I have a fill light, and I have a second LED panel over on this side that is giving me this side lighting. I also have my ceiling light on, which is what is giving me this kind of hair/rim lighting up top here. And that is basically the same thing that we'll be doing to this shot. By strategically placing off-camera light sources, we'll be able to just give all the interesting parts of our shot more emphasis and shape. All right, so with the main workhorse lights of our scene in place, it's now time to start adding some accent lights to this. So there are still a bunch of areas of the scene that are just either too dark or just flat and uninteresting. Luckily, with a setting like this, we're extremely free to place seemingly arbitrary light sources just to give more shape and detail to areas of our scene without it actually breaking the realism of our lighting. Now, the first thing that I would like to address is getting more of a focal point on this center part of the image here, which is supposed to be the main attraction in this scene. Now, with the material that I've added to this guy, he definitely does glow. However, I would never be able to make this bright enough to actually start lighting up the walls all the way down here without this blowing all the way out or the glow just going really haywire. So what I'm going to do is basically just cheat, which is the way that set lighting works. So one perk of working in VFX as a lighter is that you get to see a lot of on-set photos, especially of the lighting setups from set, as the VFX supervisor on that show is usually, hopefully, going to be really diligent in taking witness cam photos and shots of the way that the set is set up and the way that the lighting is set up on set, just to help the VFX crews better be able to understand what's going on and how to light an asset that's supposed to go into that shot. And basically 99% of all the shots that I've ever seen have extra light sources that's just outside of the camera that aren't basically not motivated by anything in the shot at all. They're just put there to make something look good. And that's basically the same thing that we're going to do. Now we have our main light sources that are working pretty okay. But like I said, I would like this to be more intense, or at least give the impression of being more intense by having these walls lit up. I would also like for this to maybe give us some really nice light shafts going through the fog, kind of like the movie poster for The Thing. And that is also something that just this emissive material would never be able to do on its own. But we'll solve that by just putting a light source there, which is also just a lot more easy for us to art direct and control. For this, I'm thinking I'm going to use some spotlights just because they don't really have a surface area. I don't want to see the light source itself. I just want to see the way that it's affecting everything around it. But if I go back into my scene view here, if I go to my hierarchy and under light, I'll make a spotlight. I'll call this hover front A. And I'll move this around to where this guy is. All right, so the first thing that we'll need to do after having placed the light is make sure that it can actually reach the thing that we're aiming it at. So right now, if I have my light selected, go under emission and range, this is just set to 10. So you can see here by this gizmo where the light actually stops affecting any surfaces. I'm gonna pull this up quite a bit, so I'll just make sure that it covers everything. I'll set this to 50, and you can see now that it's aimed directly at this wall. Now, of course, as you can see, it's not really doing anything because it's not bright enough. For this light, and basically for most lights, I like to work in EV 100. I'll start pulling this up until it, yeah, so now you can see it starts affecting the wall. Set this to 24. For temperature, I want this to be another cold light because I want it to look like it's coming from this area and specifically from this character. So I'll pump this all the way up to 12,000, which is going to give us a really cool light. Now for this light and the one that's going to be hitting on the other side here, I don't necessarily want this to affect the fog itself, because that would make it very obvious where this light was coming from, because you would see that it was originating from here and not from our character. And as I said, I'll be adding a third light, which I'll place behind this character, that will visually affect the fog and give me light shafts from the character. So under volumetrics, I'll turn off enable. Now, of course, I want this to cast shadows, so I'll turn on shadows and ray traced shadows. The denoiser, I'll turn that off. And here you can see how much of a difference this can actually make. Because if I turn the denoiser on, you can see that a lot of the shadow back here actually gets blurred out. So the denoiser radius is just so high that you can see it's practically eating up that shadow. And since these lights are not that noisy to begin with, I'm just going to turn the denoiser off for this. Now there is another important setting for spotlights in Unity, which we haven't addressed yet. We are of course also able to change the angle of the light cone itself, so we can make it wider or narrower, as well as make the fall off from the center and out to those edges more or less pronounced. So for this light, I'm going to make it bigger because I wanted to hit more of this pillar, something like this. And now if I go to the game view, you can see that now it's covering a big part of this, but it's not hitting all of it, which is giving us this really nice gradient, just giving us a little more shape to what is basically a noisy cube. But we of course also have this inner angle. So if I go back to my scene view, so you can see as I pull this off, it's going to make the center of where this light is hitting, it's going to make that brighter, so you can get a more intense hotspot for your spotlights like this. Something like that. All right, so let's just add another one of these. Just duplicate this one. And I'll move this over to the side so that it's hitting the other pillar. Now we'll mostly keep these settings the same as the other light. I think it might be a little too bright, so I'll knock this down a couple of stops. Because what I don't want is for these to get so bright that they actually start stealing attention from our center point. So something like this. So you can see if I turn this on and off, we're still getting some really nice shadows. We're getting at least some semblance of shine from this character. All right, so with those two in place, let's try and see if we can get those light shafts that we were talking about coming from the character. So what we can do is, instead of placing a light in front of this guy, which would just give us a pretty bland cone of light coming from his general direction, we could actually just use this guy as a shadow caster, because he, especially with the way that he is posed, there's quite a bit of negative space here, like between his legs and his arms, between the arms, between the legs. So we might be able to get something interesting out of that. So what I'll do is I'll just duplicate the last light that we made, call it hover front C. Let's move that somewhere behind our friend here. To actually see the effect that we're looking for, I'm gonna have to go into the game view, and with my light selected, I'm gonna have to go back under volumetrics and turn that back on again. And you can see as I start moving this behind the character, it's giving us these really interesting light shafts. And not only are we getting these light shafts, which were our main aim for placing this light, however, you can see that we're now also getting this really nice reflection here in the pavement of the street, which is not only lighting up this area, which was way too dark, it's also giving us some really nice rim lights on some of these details. It's highlighting the edges of our characters. So we're getting this rim light right here. It's picking up some of these guys over here. It's also picking up this character sitting inside of the shed here, which is a really interesting detail of this scene, which we just couldn't see because it was just too dark. And I think what I'll be doing when I render this is that, as we saw when we looked at the animation of the camera and of this character, over the course of the shot, this character is moving upwards. I'm going to animate the light the exact same way, just at a slower pace. And that way, as the character moves up, it's going to be changing position in relation to the light as well. meaning that the light shafts or the shadows that it's casting will also be slightly changing as the shot progresses, which will hopefully give us a really interesting moving light shaft effect as well. Not too shabby for a single spotlight. Now, one effect that I would like to add is having basically like a very subtle tractor beam effect coming from the sky, hitting this character, mainly as a motivation for why the character is floating upwards. It also gives some nice directionality to this area, which right now is just a little bit all over the place. So I'm going to do that with yet another spotlight. But we're going to set this one up a bit differently. So if I go back into my scene view, I'll go under hierarchy, light, spotlight. And you can see it made a spotlight for us right here. I'll call this tractor beam, and I'll just move this up to where we can see the light source. Now, of course, the first thing that we'll need to do is extend the range of this so that it actually goes all the way down to the ground. I'll just put this up to 35. That should cover it. Now, what I'm actually looking for here is not a cone-shaped light shaft. I just want a straight up and down light for this. The way to do that is if I have my light selected and if I go under the inspector, I'll go under shape, and instead of cone, I'll set this to box. And if I go back to my scene view right now, you can see that our light now, instead of being your typical conical spotlight, it's shaped like this really elongated box. Now I, of course, need this to be brighter. So I'll go back to my game view, and I want this to be really, really bright. So I'll set this to 200,000 lux, which is really high. And now it's really hard to tell, but it is actually right here. It's just too small. So I'll set the size of this. I'll make this 3 by 3. And now you can see we're getting this really pronounced light shape right here. It's affecting the fog a little too much for my taste. So under the Volumetrics tab, I'll just put the multiplier. I'll just turn this down just a tad, just by 20% or something. Now the color for this, I want this to be really cold as well, 11,000 Kelvin. And now we have this really nice light beam that, like I said, is basically acting as a motivation for this character to be floating up like this. I'll probably also, at the end of this, like outside of the tutorial, I'll probably also add some particles or something to the shot that are going to be traveling along with this this light beam. Now, just looking at the scene the way that it is right now, it is kind of nice and contrasty. However, I do want to get a little more shape into some of these darker areas. So I can definitely see that I want to add some light in this area. I will probably want to add something that gives a little more shape to this character, because it's the way that it's placed and posed, it looks like it would be kind of a hero character for this shot. There are two characters over here and this whole area as well. I would like to get a little more shape into this shadow area, and the same goes for over here. Now this I think I'm going to do using area lights. So this will be our first area lights for this project, just because these accents, I want them to be a little softer and have a more natural fall off to them than what you get with these harsher light sources that we've been using so far. So I'll go into my hierarchy, light, and I'll make an area light. Just move this up here. So I'm thinking this accent light, we're going to use that to light up the stuff that's going on back here, and maybe even bleeding a little over to the character here. So rotate this light around and just start playing with the intensity first. So I'll change this to using EV like all my other lights. So somewhere around 23. Now, like I said, I want to light up this part back here, as well as a little bit of this character with this accent light. So I think I'm gonna have to just dock this on the side here again, just so that I can see what's going on in our actual shot. Now, of course, I want this to cast shadows, so I'll turn on shadows and ray trace shadows. Right now, I think this light source is a little too big. So the light is just a little too soft. You can see that the shadows coming from this barrier, for example, are going really soft just because this is a pretty big light source. In the viewport, you can see that the light has these little handles on each side. And if I click and drag this, it's gonna let me interactively change the size of this light. You can see that the light both goes weaker, the shadows go sharper as the light source gets smaller. So something like this. And while I'm moving this here, I'm basically always keeping an eye on what the camera is actually seeing. So I'll grab it and start moving it here, but then I'll move my eyes over here just so I can see how this is looking in the shot itself. And you can see now if I turn this light on and off, it's mostly affecting over here and over here, which makes sense because right now it's placed up here and is pointing down this direction. And if you remember the way that our camera is animated as well, it starts almost behind this barrier and moves up. So it's nice that we can actually see some of this detail as well. Just makes the start of the shot a little more interesting. All right, so let's place a couple more of these. I'll call this one accent light A. I'll hit Control D to duplicate this. And I'll call this accent light B. And I'm thinking what I'll use this one for is to get some light, maybe get a pool of light over here by these two characters that are hiding behind this barrier. So I'll just start moving this over to where they are placed. So somewhere around here. Because while I'm not necessarily looking to draw a lot of attention to this area, because it's not the most important one, I feel like some of these areas and what these characters are doing are part of what's setting the mood of the shot. So actually seeing some life or some characters in this environment is definitely going to be helpful in setting the overall mood of this shot. So I'll just try and find a good spot for this. Now, this light I might actually want to have be a little softer, so I can make the light source a little bigger, because right now with it being this small, the highlights are a little too sharp and the shadows are a little too sharp. So this part of the image is going a little too contrasty and drawing a little too much attention. So what I'll do first is I'll knock down the intensity quite a bit. But of course, this will go brighter again as soon as I start increasing the size of this light source. Maybe around twice as big as the other one was. So like 0.72 or something. The range of this up to 30, just so that it covers everything. And I might actually want to go back and do that with this light as well. You can see that it has this bounding box or bounding sphere around it. And it's basically just hitting this character. But I'm guessing that if I turn this up to 30 as well, yeah, now we're getting a bit more shape on this guy as well. Now you can see that these lights also come with a denoiser on by default. So I'm going to turn those off as well. Because you can see, especially in areas like this, where you have sharper, more contact-like shadows. If I turn the denoiser on, a lot of this just blurs out. And I'll do that for the first one that we did as well. Because we can always go back if we end up having an issue with noise from these lights and turn the denoiser back on and then start adjusting the denoiser radius if we need to, but then at least we know what we're working with. Now, the last light that we're going to add as far as accent lights go and as far as this shot goes is just a character specific rim slash shape light that I'm going to add to our main character in front here, just to get a little more both shape and some specular highlights on some of these parts, because he has this nice rim light here from this front light. However, as soon as it starts curving back here, everything is going a little flat. So I'm just going to add a last little accent light just to help us with this. So I'll go back to my scene. I'll just duplicate this accent light. I'll move that over here. Now, of course, this light is going to be extremely view dependent. So we're going to have to be able to see the game view for this to make any amount of sense. So now if I turn this on and off, you can see that we're getting a bit more shape on this guy. Just make this smaller. All right, so I think this location is pretty good. I think the size of the light source and the intensity still needs some tweaking. So you can see that when I turn this on and off, it's starting to do what we talked about that we want this accent light to do. So there's a lot more happening in this shadow area of this character. One thing I sometimes like to do is not have the area light be quadratic in shape, which can help you get especially things like specular highlights that are maybe a little more interesting, that has a little more distinct shape to them. So what I'll do is I'll just make it about half as tall as it is wide. So something like this. And this also makes it so that we're actually getting kind of a fall off of this light where it's brighter around up here, and then it gets less and less so as we move down towards the ground. We see that now we're not getting as much down here, which is helping pull our eye up to the part where we want the center of attention for this character to be. Now it's still a little bright, so I think I'm going to I'll knock it down one stop. And yeah, that's it for lighting. The only thing we have left to do now is quickly go over turning the post processes back on and having a look at where our noise level is, how much DLSS and anti-aliasing can take care of that for us, and just have a look at a really quick way of diagnosing the noise level of our image using the rendering debugger. After that, we'll render out our frames and pick it up in compositing. Okay, so before we render out our final frames, let's go back into our global volume and turn our post-processing back on. So with my global volume enabled, I'll start off with the ones that are not going to make my computer cry. I'll do those first. I'll turn on bloom. There is bloom on by default. However, you're able to change some settings using the override. So I've set the quality to medium. I've changed the threshold to 0.8 and I've set the intensity to 0.3. But you can see if I turn this on and off, what I'm basically getting is just a slightly brighter, slightly more accurate bloom. I'll turn on contact shadows. Now this is enabled in my project by default, but with this turned on, I can do things like adjust the sample count and make other changes that will affect the how heavy my renders are. All right, so now we're getting to the heavier effects. So screen space reflection and screen space global illumination are pretty heavy. So let's start off with screen space GI. I'll expand this and I'll turn it on. And you can see that this is going to make a pretty big difference, especially up here in the areas that are mostly being affected by bounced light. So you can see if I turn this back off, you can see this goes pretty flat and dark again. But with SSGI on, we're getting a lot of bounced light, both from the ground plane, from the light coming down here and hitting all of this. And all these little nooks and crannies are getting a lot more realistic lighting than what we were currently getting with our setup. So I've played around with some of these settings for this project a bit, just to get something that is actually renderable on this machine, but still looks good. So I've set the max ray length to 40, which means that any light that bounces off a surface will only move for 40 units before being terminated. The higher you set this number, the slower your SSGI calculations are going to be. For the clamp value, I've set that up to 8. So the values of the accumulated light that is not getting clamped. I've set the sample count to 6 and the bounce count to 2. The bounce count number is probably the setting that's going to have the highest effect on your performance. So for each increment of this number, any light that hits a surface is going to bounce off of it and then go on to hit other surfaces. As soon as you get to 2, adding more bounces will mostly just give you a little more light in darker areas and darker recesses where you don't necessarily have that much direct light. But for this scene, I found 2 to be perfectly adequate. Now, SSGI is probably also the noisiest process of this setup. So I am using the denoiser. I have the denoiser radius pretty low, just so that it doesn't lose that much accuracy. Now, the way that I'm tweaking a lot of these settings, and this is the way that I've tweaked the settings for things like the ambient occlusion and the screen space reflection as well, is using Unity's built-in render debugger. So if I go under Window, Analysis, and I'll select Render Debugger, I'll dock this down here. Under the Lighting tab, if I scroll down to the full screen debug mode, here you have the ability to isolate a lot of different processes that are part of the final rendered frame. So if I, for example, from the dropdown, if I choose screen space ambient occlusion, it's just going to show me what the screen space AO is doing. And this lets me see how noisy or not a part of this process is. So you can see that it's fairly noisy, but the noise is pretty fine grained, meaning that the DLSS is probably going to be able to take care of most of this. But if I go to screen space GI, you can see that this pass is a lot noisier, and this is still with the denoiser turned on. So if I turn denoising off, you can see how incredibly noisy the SSGI pass is straight out of the box. And this is with 6 samples. Now I could keep increasing this. So if I turn this down to 2, you can see that it gets even more noisy. I can set it up to 10, which makes it a lot better, but it's definitely diminishing returns, and having more of these samples can get really heavy really fast. So I found 6 to be the sweet spot for this specific shot, but only when running the denoiser as well. Now I can set the denoiser pass up, which does take care of a lot of the noise. However, you're then also losing a lot of the detail of this pass. So you can see things like behind these pipes, for example, with this at 0.5, a lot of this shading is disappearing. So you're mostly just getting GI for the bigger surfaces. But if I set this back down to 0.1, you can see we're starting to get a lot more of these smaller details again. Now the debugger has analysis previews for most of the stuff that you'll be using in a shot like this. So we can have a look at contact shadows, for example. This is what our contact shadows look like. And if I set this to screen space reflections, it's just going to go black because we haven't turned that on. But if I go to the global volume and turn my screen space reflections on, you can see that these are all our screen space reflections. And what's nice with this is that it lets you see which materials are set up in a way that they're actually getting screen space reflections. So if I go in my inspector here and have a look at the screen space reflection settings, there is a setting here for minimum smoothness, meaning that any material that is rougher than 0.3 smoothness is not going to actually get screen space reflections. They are going to get the fallback, basically meaning that they'll reflect the HDRI Sky in our scene instead. But if I start pulling this down, you can see that it's adding more and more of our scene to the SSGI calculation. So what I basically did was that I tried a bunch of these settings until I found a level where it wasn't really making a visual impact on what I could see in the rendered frame, but it was definitely having an impact on how heavy my scene was. So I'll set this back to none to see my final frame. Now with all of this tweaked, I've gone over and adjusted the amount of samples for the lights and all these post processes. You can see that it's still pretty noisy in areas. Around here, it's pretty fine. However, you have areas like here where the screen space reflection especially is pretty noisy, and the GI is also pretty noisy in areas. You can definitely see it when the shot is moving. And of course, we still have no anti-aliasing turned on, which you can see like on this light post here, for example, you can see that it's really jaggy. So especially for these straight lines, we're definitely going to need to have some AA turned on, which will also luckily take care of a lot of our noise problem. So I'll go back to my camera, and under rendering, I'll turn on allow dynamic resolution. And with that turned on, I get the allow DLSS checkbox. I'll turn that on as well. And now you can see how everything gets softer. It's taking care of most of our noise. These jaggies are gone. The image goes a little bit softer, but a lot of that is honestly just the aliasing of our geometry being fixed. So in some areas, we're actually getting tricked into thinking that there is sharper detail, while it is actually just aliasing. So as soon as the anti-aliasing smooths that out, it might look like the whole image is going a little soft, but that isn't necessarily always the case. Of course, any anti-aliasing is going to make things slightly softer, but we can always go in comp and sharpen things up just a tiny bit if we need any of that to come back. However, this looks pretty good to me. The only thing that I have left to do now is to jump into Recorder, render out our final sequence, and I'll do that off camera. If you want to know how to actually set up a sequence render using Recorder, there's a video for that on the channel that you can check out somewhere. And when the shot is done rendering, I'll see you back in Nuke for final touches and a little bit of compositing. All right, so with our main renders now done, our final step is going to be to add just a little more detail and effects to our scene, as well as a quick grading pass before rendering out our final shot. While it is possible to add versions of these effects as well as grading directly into our shot setup in Unity's post-processing, Nuke does have a suite of very flexible and powerful tools that are really hard to compete with. And since we're now not actually baking these effects or the grade into our rendered frames, we are also now moving this part of the process out of Unity, meaning that this task can now also be done by an actual compositing artist, leading to not only faster turnaround times, but also a better end result. Now that we've rendered our final shot, the only thing left is to bring our frames into Nuke for just a little bit of extra refinement, grading, and adding some final touches. Now, some of the tools that I'm going to be using in Nuke do not come with Nuke by default. They are, however, free. So there is a package of Nuke tools called the Nuke Survival Toolkit, which contains a selection of user-created third-party plugins for Nuke that are totally free and fairly easy to install as well. I'll make sure to put a link to the Survival Kit in the description of this video. If you are a Nuke user, I would definitely recommend downloading this suite of free tools. There are some really great plugins in there that just makes some of this process a lot easier and straightforward for someone who is not a professional compositor or a Nuke power user, which I'm not by any stretch of the imagination. So now the first thing that we're going to want to do is just to make sure that the color management is set up in a way that fits the material that we've actually rendered out. So what I've done is I've rendered out a frame that's already tone mapped with the ACES tone mapper. So I'm going to want my color management settings in Nuke to reflect that. So if I click in the node graph, hit S on my keyboard, that's going to bring up the project settings. Now, if I go over to the color tab, you can see that it's set to using Nuke's color management, which in this case is fine. For the OCIO config, we're going to want to use ACES 1.2, which is the latest version of the ACES color config. And Unity uses an ACES tone mapper internally as well. It might not be updated to 1.2, I'm not sure, but the difference should not be that big. With that done, I'll click back to my node graph. To read in my renders, I could either hit Tab to open up the node creation dialog and type read and select it from the list here. I can also just hit the letter R on my keyboard, which will open up the file read dialog. And I can now browse to my recorder folder in this project and just select the frame sequence that I rendered out. For this specific project, I opted for not using any AOVs at all. So this is just the straight beauty render. We're not going to be doing any complicated compositing or AOV layering or anything like that for this specific project. So the only thing I need to load in is my beauty. I'll hit open. This is going to plop down a read node with these frames loaded in. Now, if I select this and hit 1 on my keyboard, it's going to hook this directly up to my viewer number 1, which is going to show up here. I can make this a little smaller just so we can see. And here you can see these are my rendered frames. Now, as I mentioned, I ended up adding a little bit of particles to this scene just to get some more of that upwards movement in this tractor beam. There are also some smaller like ash dirt particles that'll pop up every now and then. If you want me to make a separate video on how I set up these extremely simple particle systems, definitely let me know in the comments and I'll make sure to make a little tutorial about that as well. But as you can see here, we have our robot guy floating up. The camera is moving from behind the barrier. And you can see we also have this spotlight that we placed behind this character, which is moving at a different rate than the character itself, giving us this really interesting moving light shaft pattern. All right, so we could call it quits here. This would be perfectly fine for a lot of use cases. However, I do think it's still a little flat. There are also some camera effects that I want to add to this in compositing. So we'll be doing a little bit of grading as well as adding some of these lens effects. Now, the first thing that I want to do is just to give this a really rough grade just for the entire image, just to get it a little more contrasty as well as a little more punchy in some areas. So with my read node selected, I'll hit tab on my keyboard, I'll type grade, and that'll add a grade node. It'll show up in my properties dialog, and I'll start at the top here. I'll lift my black point up just a tiny bit. So you can see it's a very low number, but if I zoom in here and with my grade node selected, if I hit D on my keyboard, that'll disable this node. And you can see the difference that it makes. It's not major, it just crushes the black levels just a little bit so that some of these darker shadows get a little more contrasty. And I can do the same thing with the white point as well. Also very, very subtle, but it just lifts up some of these highlights just a little bit. Next thing that I'll change is I'll try and gain this up a little bit because it's feeling both flat and a little dark to me. So I'm gonna pop this up quite a bit. I don't want to totally change my image. I mean, I was happy with the lighting that I did. However, I think I can at least bring this up to about maybe somewhere around here, 1.2, 1.3. That'll just make these highlights just pop a little more. And just to get a little bit more contrast, I'm going to pull the gamma down just a little bit. Now, if I select my grade node again and hit D on my keyboard, you can see that while the changes are fairly subtle, it does make the image just a little more punchy, a little more contrasty than what we had before. Next up is the first of the lens effects. And just scrubbing through this, it's just looking a little CG because everything is so perfect. All the edges are a little too perfect. One very popular lens effect to make this look a little bit more like it was shot on a real camera is using chromatic aberration. I really like the chromatic aberration effect from the survival toolkit. So with the grade node selected, I'll hit tab on my keyboard again. I'll type AP Chroma. Now by default, it doesn't look like anything changed because it didn't. But as soon as we start adding translation and scaling to this, it's going to do what chromatic aberration does, and it's going to start splitting the color channels apart. So if I set translate X to something like 5 and this to something like 1, you can see that it already got a little softer, and you can see it's already starting to give us this color fringing right here. So you can see the red channel is going out this direction and the blue channel is going out this direction. Now for scale, this is going to have a huge effect. And you can see that the more I add to this, you can basically pull the image apart. Now, of course, this is way too much for just a simple lens effect. I'm going to set this to 1.07. There is a setting here for samples. And what the samples does, and you can see this a little easier if I just bring this back up again. So you can see here, we're getting all these slices of our image, and each one of these is basically a sample. Now, if I start increasing the sample amount, you can see that it's adding more and more slices until this is basically a softer transition. However, this can get a little heavy. I'll just set this back down to 10. And of course, this is way more than what we're looking for. We just want a really subtle effect, just adding a little bit of realism to our shot, making it look like it was shot on an actual physical camera. And of course, with the setting of the shot as well, having some artifacting and some physicality to that shot, you can probably go a little stronger in a setting like this than you would otherwise do for a normal standard shot. I'll set this back down to 0.07. And of course, this is way too much. And the way that the aberration works is that the splitting of the color channels is stronger out here on the edges. So you can see here, for example, the effect is noticeable, but a lot more subtle than what we're getting out here, where you can basically not even recognize the contents of the image anymore. If I go back here under settings, there is an aberration slider here, and this works basically as a multiplier for everything else going on in the node. So what I can do is, if I start pulling this back down, it's going to reduce the effect that the aberration has on the image. So if I go to 0, I'm getting no effect at all, but I can start reintroducing some of it. And you can see it's especially noticeable on these brighter highlights and on the edges of these objects. And like I said, I only want a really subtle effect. So if I select my AP Chroma node and hit D to disable, you can see the difference that it makes. So the image does look a little softer just because you now have the color channels are splitting apart, but not really by much. And it's not really doing that much to the stuff that's in the center, which is the focal point of our shot. And if we zoom out, you can barely even see the effect that we're doing. It's just blending everything a little more together. So you can see out here on the edges, we're getting a lot of aberration. But down here, it's not really that noticeable. Okay, so next up, I want to add a little bit of lens distort to this. Now, of course, we're not actually combining this with a live action plate. However, since we are in here adding lens effects, I think adding a little bit of lens distortion is probably going to be nice for the look that we're going for. So what I'll do is, with my AP Chroma selected, I'll hit Tab again. I'll type distort. That will give me the lens distortion node and hook that up to the output from our AP Chroma. We'll just use the Nuke X Classic for this, a spherical lens. I'll go down under output and just make sure that the mode is set to redistort, because that's what we'll be doing. By default, it's set to undistort. I'll leave everything else here at default. The only thing that I want to change is the denominator. And the denominator is going to be the parameter that sets the amount of lens distortion that we're getting. So you can see if I start pulling the slider, it's going to start distorting our image in this one axis, and then this distorts in the other axis. So I'll set this to 0.05 and the other denominator to -0.05. And you can see that now we're just getting a slight lens distortion, so things are getting a little curved as they move out towards the edges of the frame. So if I select my lens distort node and hit D, you can see that this is the amount of distortion that we're getting. And it's not really that visible, it's just some of these straight edges are getting a really slight curve to it, as well as this light post, because it's all the way out at the edge of the frame. It's getting bent just a little bit. Now there are only two more effects that I want to do to this comp. One is grading just a region of this image, as well as add a subtle bit of vignetting to this whole thing. I'll start by adding another grade node. And what I'm basically looking to do here is do some selective grading just to the center of this image. Basically just to help a little with where the focal point of the image is. What I can do is, if I go over to my new grade node, I'll just gain this up by a little bit, so about 0.2 extra gain. And now, of course, this is affecting the entire image, but we'll go in and mask this out. On my gamma, set that up to 1.02. To mask this out is fairly simple. I can go up here to my toolbar, and if I hit the draw icon, I can choose a roto node, which is going to drop down a roto node. I'll hook the background of my roto node up to the crop node. And if I double click on this, I can now start clicking directly on my viewer here to paint down a roto spline, which will work as the mask for this grade node. Now over in the properties panel, I'll make sure that output is set to alpha. I'll set pre-multiply to alpha as well. And now if I go back to my grade node, you can see that it has this little extra arrow here on the right hand side. If I pull this, you can see by the label that this is the mask input for this grade node. I can now hook that up to the roto node, and now it's using this roto mask as a mask for the effects of this grade. So now what I can do is if I select my grade node again, if I just pull the gain way up, you can see that it's now only affecting whatever is on the inside of this spline mask here. Now, of course, this transition is going to be really harsh, and it can be a little hard to see with the spline in here, but as long as I have my cursor hovering over the viewer, if I hit Q on my keyboard, it's going to go ahead and hide the overlay of that spline, making this a little easier to see. Now, if I double click my roto node again, as long as I have this Bezier curve selected, I can go to this feather parameter and start pulling the slider. And you can see that it's going to start blurring out the and feathering out these edges. I'll pull that all the way up to 100. And now I can go back into the grade node and just pull this gain back to where we had it at 1.2. Now if I select my grade node and hit D to disable the node, you can see the effect that this is having. So we're making this part of the image a little more gained up, which is working pretty nicely when it comes to actually keeping our center of attention right here. Now, the last effect that we'll add is a little bit of vignetting to the edges, just another lens effect. So with my grade node selected, I'll hit Tab. I'll start typing vignette. And here's another one of the survival toolkit plugins called AP Vignette. I'll select that. And you can see that automatically adds pretty strong vignetting to this. So with my AP Vignette node active, I can go over here in the properties and start moving this around a little. So for size, it's basically going to decide where you want the outer edges of the vignetting to be. If you want to just affect the outer edges of the frame, or if you want it to be more of like a binocular vision, I'm going to set this, I just want this to be a subtle effect, so I'll set this to around 1.7 for this. With the fall off setting, you're basically setting where on the image you want it to start blending into this vignetting. So I'll put this around 2.4-ish. And then I have this amount slider, which is basically a multiplier for this whole effect. Now we're already getting a bit of this effect from the grade that we did, so I don't need that much. I just want to subtly emphasize the area of interest just a little bit more. So I can set this to around 0.7 or something like that. So if I disable my vignette, you can see that it's not making a huge difference. It's just taking some of the attention away from these outer corners and pulling it into the center of the image. Now, the final thing that we have to do now is just render our finished comp. And I'll do that by having the AP vignette selected. Again, I could hit Tab and type right and plop down a right node. I can also, with the AP vignette selected, just hit W on my keyboard which directly just drops down a write node. Now with the write node active, I'll go over to the properties panel, hit the little folder icon next to the file field. I'll browse to wherever I want to save this. And when I'm in this folder, one thing that I have to remember is that I have to input the full file name and all the strings in this field. I could do it out here as well, but it needs to be there for the renderer to work. So I'll just call this Unity environment class comp render version 3. And then I'll add an underscore and 4 hash signs. So it'll use this field to add the frame number. If you don't have this, it's just going to save the same frame over itself over and over again. So you'll basically just end up with the last frame rendered. But with this field, it's going to understand that it needs to add the frame number to the file name. .exr and hit save. And you can see it automatically detects this file extension, giving us the save options for this file type. So it automatically changes the file type to EXR. We're going to leave all this at default, and I'll hit render, which will pop up the render dialog. And I'll just make sure that the frame range is correct. It's set to the input, so it's picking whatever we have in our project settings. We have 200 frames of animation, so that is correct. And I'll just hit OK, and it'll start rendering. Alright, so I hope that was helpful. Thanks for sitting through this whole thing. And I hope that you walk away from this video with a better understanding of what possibilities you actually have at your disposal building and lighting a dark, gritty urban night shot like this one. Now, if you want more practical lessons like this one in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel, maybe even leave a like so our algorithmic overlords know that you want more and that this whole video isn't just a burning dumpster fire.